Okay, our domain model is ready. Now we want to use code first migrations to create our database. So if you use Visual Studio, in Package Manager console, you use add migration command and specify a name for your migration, like initial model. If you're not using Visual Studio, you should do it in terminal using Entity Framework command in .NET CLI. So .NET EF migrations add initial model. Okay, we got an error here. Could not load file or assembly Microsoft.entityframeworkcore.design. So earlier, I forgot to include this assembly as part of installing Entity Framework. So .NET add package Microsoft.entityframeworkcore.design. Then we do .NET restore. And finally execute add migration one more time. Now, as I explained in my Entity Framework course, when it comes to migrations, you should use baby steps. So you should make small changes to your domain model and create a migration. Because every time you create a migration, you should properly review it to make sure it doesn't have an adverse effect on the database. For example, you're not going to lose the data. So if you make a big step and create a big domain model, you will end up with a gigantic migration. And that increases the chance for errors. And that's the reason I didn't implement all the classes in our domain model, like feature, vehicle, and so on. I've only implemented make and model. Now let's review our migration. So here in the migrations folder, this is our initial migration. Look, it's empty. What's going on here? That's an issue that you may encounter quite frequently when using code first migrations. The reason for this is because Entity Framework looks at our DB context to determine what our domain model looks like. Let's go to our DB context. So Vega DB context. In this class, we don't have any DB sets. So from Entity Framework's point of view, there is nothing in our domain model. Even though we created these classes, make and model, Entity Framework does not see them as part of our domain model. So here we need to add a DB set. Prop DB set of make and call it makes. Now let's import the namespace. Okay. Do we need to add another DB set for models? Not necessarily. Because Entity Framework starts from this make class, let's take a look here. So here we have a relationship to the model class. And this way, Entity Framework can implicitly discover this class. So we don't need to explicitly add a DB set of models here. We would need that only if we want to directly query them. For now, we don't have any requirements for that, so I'm going to leave it here. Save. Now we need to recreate our migration. In Entity Framework 6, we could use the force switch to recreate a migration. But we don't have this option at the time of recording this video. So there are two options here. We can create another migration, or we can remove the last migration and create it again. So here's our migration. Now in Entity Framework 6, if a migration was not applied to the database, we could simply go and delete it here. But we should never, ever physically delete migrations when using Entity Framework Core. Because here we have a new file which represents the snapshot of the current database schema in code. And this snapshot should always be in sync with the migrations we have created here. In Entity Framework 6, when we added a migration, Entity Framework would interact with the database, look at the database schema, and then compare it with our domain model. And based on that, it would create a migration. With this snapshot file, because we have the current database schema represented in the code, Entity Framework doesn't need to interact with the database. So it can simply compare the snapshot with the current domain model. So if you want to remove a migration, instead of physically deleting that file, you need to execute a command. If you're using Visual Studio, you use remove migration. Just like we have add migration, we also have remove migration. And this command removes the very last migration that is not applied to the database. If you're using .NET CLI, you execute .NET EF migrations remove. So this command will remove the last migration and also update the snapshot to make sure everything is in sync. Okay, I got an error. Let's see what's happening here. A network-related or instance-specific error occurred while establishing a connection to SQL Server. Why are we getting this error here? Because when you execute remove migration, Entity Framework needs to look at your database to make sure that last migration is not applied to the database. Now, in this video, I have deliberately removed access to my SQL Server so you can see this error here. So basically, in the last section, I used a Docker image to run SQL Server on a Mac. If you're using Windows, chances are your SQL Server is always running in the background. On Mac and Linux, SQL Server is accessible as long as it's running inside a Docker container. So that means if I restart my machine, that Docker container is not going to be there. So here in another terminal window, let's execute Docker PS. You can see there is no container running. So I'm going to run SQL Server image inside a container one more time. This is the command that we used in the last section. Now, if you're a Windows user, sorry about these details. Please be patient and we're going to move on pretty quickly. Okay, for some strange reason, I'm not getting those log messages when SQL Server started. I just get a container ID. That made me think the container is going to terminate immediately. However, if I run Docker PS, you can see my container is up and running. So now back in our original window, I'm going to remove the last migration. Okay, beautiful. Entity Framework removed the last migration. Now, in case you're curious how Entity Framework knows where our database is, it looks at this configure services method in the startup class. So earlier, we configured our DB context, and here we specified the connection string, right? So Entity Framework looks at this to discover what database it needs to connect to. Okay, now if you look at the migrations folder, there is absolutely nothing here. So Entity Framework removed our migration, and because there was nothing in the snapshot, it also removed the snapshot. So now I'm going to create our migration one more time. .NET EF migrations add initial model. Okay, now let's review this migration. It's no longer empty. Here we create a table called makes with these two columns, ID and name. Below that, we create another table called model with 3 columns, ID, make ID, and name. So finally, we need to apply this migration to our database. In Visual Studio, we can run update database. And in terminal, we run .NET EF database update. Beautiful. So here I'm using SQL Pro on Mac. If you're using Windows, you would use SQL Server Management Studio to look at your database. So let's connect to our database. Okay, here's our Viga database. Look, tables. We've got Entity Framework Migrations History table, as well as our makes and models tables. This is very similar to SQL Server Management Studio. We can also write new queries here. We can right-click a table and select the top 100 rows. We can script it, export it, import it, and so on.